July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong steps onto the dusty surface of the moon. 650 million people watch on television. As he plants the American flag, it is presented as the ultimate triumph of human ingenuity, freedom, and courage. Except behind those glossy TV broadcasts and patriotic speeches lay a bloody trail of incinerated astronauts, erased cosmonauts, hidden nuclear explosions, and former Nazi war criminals. To win the space race, both the United States and the Soviet Union risked hundreds of human lives, covered up horrific industrial disasters, and cut deals with the devil himself. So how did two superpowers turn the quest for the stars into one of the most dangerous, unethical, and secret proxy wars in human history? To understand the dark side of the space race, we have to go back to 1945 in the smoldering ruins of Nazi Germany. Before there was NASA, before there was Apollo, there was the V-2 rocket. Developed by Nazi Germany, it was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. The genius mind behind the V-2 was a brilliant young German engineer named Wernher von Braun. To the American public in the 1950s and 60s, von Braun would be marketed as a charming, friendly scientist who loved Disney and dreamed of exploring the stars. But the United States government conveniently sanitized von Braun's resume. Von Braun was not just a scientist. He was an officer in the Nazi SS, and his V-2 rockets were built using forced slave labor from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Picture an underground fortress dug into a mountain, freezing, pitch black, and infested with disease. Thousands of prisoners, Jews, French partisans, Russian prisoners of war, were forced to build rocket parts by hand under the whips of SS guards. If a prisoner dropped a screw or looked tired, they were hanged from a crane in the middle of the assembly line as a warning to others. Here is a sickening historical fact. More people died building the V-2 rockets inside those underground tunnels than were actually killed by the rockets exploding in London. Over 20,000 slave laborers perished. So when World War II ended in 1945, von Braun and his team of Nazi scientists should have been put on trial at Nuremberg, right? Not even close. The American military took one look at von Braun's rocket designs and realized something. Whoever controlled these men would control the future of warfare. So the US government launched a secret program called Operation Paperclip. American intelligence officers quietly scrubbed von Braun's SS record, erased his ties to concentration camps, and smuggled him and over 1,600 German scientists into the United States. Sir, this German scientist was a member of the SS and used slave labor to build weapons for Hitler. Yes, but can he build a missile that can fly across the Atlantic Ocean? Well, yes. Then burn his file, give him a fresh suit, and welcome him to Alabama. Just like that, the architect of Nazi terror became the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, building the Saturn V rocket that would eventually carry Americans to the moon. While America was hiring Nazi scientists, the Soviet Union was building its own space program under complete, impenetrable secrecy. And in 1960, that obsession with secrecy caused the deadliest catastrophe in spaceflight history. Look at this spot on the map, deep in the desert of Kazakhstan, the Baikonur Cosmodrome. It is October 1960. The Soviet Union is preparing to launch a massive new intercontinental ballistic missile, the R-16. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev wanted a massive military display to flex on the United States for the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. The man in charge of the launch was Field Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin, a ruthless military commander who cared deeply about pleasing Khrushchev and did not care at all about safety protocols. The engineers were rushing. On October 23rd, the R-16 rocket was sitting on the launch pad fully fueled with hypergolic propellants. Hypergolic fuel means the two chemicals ignite instantly the moment they touch each other. It is insanely volatile, highly corrosive, and lethal to inhale. Suddenly, a fuel leak was detected on the rocket. Standard safety protocol dictated that the launch should be aborted immediately. The fuel drained, and the rocket moved back to the hangar. But draining the fuel would mean missing Khrushchev's political deadline. Field Marshal Nedelin refused to delay. He ordered technicians to stay on the launch pad and fix the leaking electrical wires right there on a live, fully fueled mega rocket. To prove to the terrified technicians that the pad was safe, Nedelin actually dragged a lawn chair out into the open air and sat down right next to the rocket. Dozens of engineers, top scientists, and military officers were packed around the base of the rocket like mechanics working on a car. "Marshal, shouldn't we evacuate the pad while repairs are being made? What are you afraid of? Look at me. I am sitting right here. Get back to work." At 6:45 p.m., a catastrophic glitch occurred inside the control system. The second stage engine accidentally ignited right there on the launch pad, blasting a stream of superheated fire directly into the fully fueled first stage tank below it. The entire rocket detonated into a massive, blinding fireball. The temperature at the launch pad instantly spiked to over 3,000 degrees Celsius. The blast was so hot that the tarmac on the ground literally melted into liquid tar. Technicians who tried to run away caught fire and got stuck in the melting asphalt. Over 100 top Soviet engineers, scientists, and technicians were burned alive in seconds. Marshal Nedelin himself was vaporized. The only thing left of him was a melted metal found in the ashes. So how did the Soviet Union react to a tragedy that wiped out their brightest scientific minds in a single night? They lied. The Kremlin immediately stamped top secret on the whole event. They told the world that Field Marshal Nedelin had died in a tragic airplane crash. The families of the dead scientists were told their husbands had died of sudden illnesses. The Nedelin catastrophe was so thoroughly buried that the Russian public did not learn the truth until 1989, nearly 30 years after it happened. By the mid-1960s, the space race had turned into an absolute pressure cooker. The Soviets had achieved the first satellite, the first dog in space, the first man in space, and the first spacewalk. President John F. Kennedy had promised that America would land a man on the moon before the decade was out. NASA was under immense pressure from Washington to move fast, cut corners, and beat Moscow at all costs. And that desperate rush to stay on schedule proved fatal. In January 1967, 3 veteran astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, were sitting inside the Apollo 1 command module on a launch pad at Cape Kennedy. They were preparing for a routine plug-in test to make sure the spacecraft could run on its own power. From the very beginning, the Apollo capsule was a death trap waiting for a spark. First, NASA decided to pressurize the cabin with 100% pure oxygen. In pure oxygen, things that normally burn slowly explode into furious infernos. Second, the capsule was packed with flammable materials, including hundreds of square feet of Velcro. Third, and most foolishly of all, the hatch opened inward and required a complex mechanical ratcheting system that took at least 90 seconds to open from the inside. Astronaut Gus Grissom was so frustrated with the spacecraft's constant electrical glitches that he hung a lemon on the simulator. How are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 buildings? On January 27, 1967, at 6:31 p.m., a short circuit sparked underneath Grissom's seat. In a 100% pure oxygen atmosphere, that tiny spark ignited like a bomb. Within 3 seconds, the inside of the capsule turned into a raging furnace. The pressure inside spiked so fast that the walls of the capsule ruptured. Over the radio, ground control heard a panicked shout. "We've got a fire in the cockpit!" Then screaming. Then silence. It took technicians 5 agonizing minutes to fight through the thick smoke and open the hatch. By the time they opened it, all 3 astronauts had died of asphyxiation. Their nylon spacesuits melted to the interior of the spacecraft. NASA halted the Apollo program for over a year to redesign the capsule, completely replacing the hatch, removing flammable materials, and ditching the pure oxygen atmosphere on the pad. The sacrifice of Apollo 1 saved future astronauts, but it took 3 men burning to death on a launch pad to get NASA to slow down and stop cutting corners. If you thought NASA was under political pressure, the Soviet space program was practically running with a gun held to its head. Just 3 months after the Apollo 1 fire, in April 1967, the Soviet Union was celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Premier Leonid Brezhnev demanded a spectacular space mission to prove Soviet superiority. The plan was simple on paper: launch Soyuz 1 carrying cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov. Then launch Soyuz 2 the next day, dock the 2 spacecraft in orbit, and have 2 cosmonauts spacewalk from one ship to the other. It was a brilliant political stunt. There was just one tiny problem. The Soyuz 1 spacecraft was nowhere near ready. Engineers inspected the ship and found over 200 structural and technical faults. The hatch was too small, the parachutes were flawed, and the electrical systems were completely unstable. Technicians wrote a 50-page report begging the leadership to delay the launch. Nobody dared send the report to Brezhnev. In the Soviet system, bringing bad news to the leader could end your career or send you to a gulag. Vladimir Komarov knew the ship was a death trap. His best friend was Yuri Gagarin, the national hero who had become the first man in space. Gagarin was assigned as Komarov's backup for the mission. Komarov's friends begged him to refuse to fly. "If I don't fly this mission, they will send Yuri instead. He will die for me. I have to protect him." On April 23, 1967, Komarov boarded Soyuz 1. Yuri Gagarin showed up at the launch pad acting completely uncharacteristic, screaming at launch directors, demanding a spacesuit, trying to delay the launch to save his friend. He failed. Soyuz 1 blasted off into space. The moment Komarov reached orbit, everything went wrong. One of the solar panels failed to deploy, cutting the ship's electrical power in half. The thermal control failed. The ship began spinning violently out of control. Ground control canceled the launch of Soyuz 2, leaving Komarov stranded in a dying spacecraft. For 24 hours, Komarov fought frantically to regain control of the ship. Finally, he managed to align the vessel manually and re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. He had survived the worst of it. He was heading home. Then came the final design flaw. When the drogue parachute deployed, it failed to pull out the main parachute because the canopy chamber was too narrow. Komarov released the emergency parachute, but it tangled directly with the drogue chute. Soyuz 1 plummeted toward the Earth at over 300 miles per hour. Listening stations in U.S. intelligence bases in Turkey picked up Komarov's final radio transmissions to Soviet ground control. As his spacecraft plunged to the ground, Komarov was heard screaming in rage, cursing the engineers and the politicians who had put him in a broken machine. Soyuz 1 slammed into the Russian steppe with the force of a meteorite. The impact crushed the capsule, and the remaining thruster rockets exploded, melting the wreckage into a heap of slag. When rescue teams arrived, the only recognizable part of Vladimir Komarov left was a charred heel bone. The deaths of Apollo 1 and Soyuz 1 were horrific, but at least those men were honored with state funerals. Other victims of the space race were quietly erased from history altogether. Take the case of Valentin Bondarenko. In March 1961, just weeks before Yuri Gagarin was set to make history, 24-year-old cosmonaut trainee Valentin Bondarenko was finishing a 10-day isolation test in a high-oxygen pressure chamber. After removing medical sensors from his skin, he cleaned his skin with an alcohol-soaked cotton ball and carelessly tossed the cotton ball onto a hot electric hot plate used for cooking tea. In the pure oxygen environment, the chamber burst into flames. By the time doctors opened the heavy pressure door, Bondarenko had suffered third-degree burns over his entire body. He died in a hospital hours later. Fearing that the tragedy would ruin the publicity for Gagarin's upcoming launch, the Soviet government erased Bondarenko. They airbrushed his face out of official group photographs of the original cosmonaut squad. His name was erased from official records. It was not until 1986, 25 years later, that the Soviet Union finally admitted Valentin Bondarenko had ever existed. If NASA had known about Bondarenko's tragic death in a pure oxygen chamber in 1961, they might have redesigned the Apollo 1 capsule and saved the lives of Grissom, White, and Chaffee 6 years later. The obsession with secrecy did not just cost lives in the past, it directly killed people in the future. And for decades, rumors circulated about the lost cosmonauts, alleged Soviet spaceflights launched before Gagarin that failed, resulting in cosmonauts drifting endlessly into deep space or burning up on re-entry, while the Kremlin deleted their names from the history books. While many of these extreme lost cosmonaut urban legends remain unproven, the verified cover-ups, from Bondarenko to the Nedelin disaster, show that both sides were more than willing to treat human beings as expendable fuel in a propaganda war. When we look back at the space race today, we remember the breathtaking photographs of Earth, Neil Armstrong's famous boot print, and the giant leap for mankind. We like to think of it as the ultimate expression of human curiosity and courage. But the truth is far darker. The race to the moon was a high-stakes Cold War proxy conflict driven by national paranoia, built by former Nazi war criminals, paid for with the lives of brave men, and lubricated by political lies. The heroes who died did not just die for science. They died because politicians cared more about beating deadlines than preserving human life. If you learned something new today, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. And if you think the dark side of the space race was wild, wait until you hear about the secret historical war where 30 million people died because one man convinced himself he was the brother of Jesus Christ. Click here to watch the story of the Taiping Rebellion next, and I will catch you next time.